She stood in a wedding dress she didn't choose, about to marry a man she didn't love, signing away her future to save her mother's life. And the most terrifying part wasn't the marriage itself, but the moment she realized she had absolutely no idea what this stranger would expect from her on their wedding night. This is a story about impossible choices, about what happens when desperation writes the contract, but the heart tries to rewrite the ending. And it starts in the one place where dreams are supposed to come true, but sometimes turn into the most beautiful prisons imaginable, New York City. The city never slept, but on the night before her wedding, Elena Carter desperately wished it would. From the narrow window of her childhood apartment in Brooklyn, she watched yellow cabs blur past like streaks of a life that no longer felt like hers. She was 23 years old, with her whole future supposedly ahead of her, but all she could think about was a contract sitting on her kitchen table. The one that would trade her independence, her body, her choices, for one thing she couldn't put a price on: her mother's survival. Elena had always believed New York symbolized possibility. This was a city where hard work got rewarded, where dreams were earned through grit and determination, where love was something you chose, not something forced upon you by circumstance. But tomorrow, she would walk down an aisle toward a man she'd met exactly 3 times, and none of those meetings had lasted longer than 20 minutes. She would say vows she didn't mean to a stranger whose eyes she couldn't read, and then, God, she didn't even want to think about what came after then. But we need to back up, because Elena's story doesn't really start the night before her wedding. It starts 6 months earlier, in a hospital waiting room that smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams, where a doctor with kind eyes and terrible news sat down across from Elena and her mother and said the words that would shatter everything. Stage 3 cancer, aggressive treatment needed immediately, and insurance that would cover maybe a quarter of what survival would cost. Elena's mother, Margaret Carter, had raised her daughter alone after Elena's father disappeared when she was 5. Margaret worked 2 jobs her entire life, one as a school secretary during the day, another cleaning office buildings at night, to make sure Elena had everything she needed. Not everything she wanted, but everything she needed. Margaret taught her daughter that intimacy was sacred, that trust was everything, that giving yourself to someone should never be about obligation or pressure, but about genuine connection and love. Elena had taken those lessons to heart. While her friends in high school and college were exploring relationships and physical intimacy, Elena held back, not because she was afraid or ashamed, but because she was waiting for something real. Being a virgin at 23 wasn't something she advertised, but it wasn't something she hid either. It was simply a reflection of how deeply she valued the idea of true connection. She believed love should feel safe, chosen, mutual. That belief was about to be tested in ways she never imagined. The medical bills started arriving 2 weeks after the diagnosis. First came the hospital charges for the initial test and biopsy, $12,000. Then the oncologist consultations, another $8,000. The chemotherapy treatment plan came with an estimate that made Elena's hands shake when she opened the envelope, for $175,000 for the full course of treatment, not including potential complications, hospital stays, or the experimental drugs the doctor said might be Margaret's best chance at survival. Their insurance company found every possible loophole to deny coverage. Pre-existing condition clauses Elena didn't know existed. Experimental treatment exclusions. Out-of-network provider penalties. The appeals process took weeks they didn't have while Margaret's condition deteriorated. Elena worked 3 jobs. Her full-time position as a junior editor at a small publishing house, weekend shifts at a bookstore, and late-night freelance copywriting. But even working herself to exhaustion, she was drowning in debt that accumulated faster than she could breathe. The debt collectors started calling. Foreclosure notices appeared on the door of the small Brooklyn apartment Margaret had worked 20 years to buy. Elena stopped sleeping, stopped eating properly, stopped doing anything except work and worry, and watch her mother fade a little more each day. She was losing the only parent she'd ever known, losing their home, losing hope, and there was absolutely nothing she could do about it. Until Daniel Whitmore's attorney walked into that hospital waiting room. His name was Richard Chun, and he wore a suit that probably cost more than Elena made in 3 months. He sat down beside her with the careful politeness of someone delivering news that would change everything, and he said, "Miss Carter, I represent Daniel Whitmore. I believe we may have a solution to your current financial difficulties. Elena had heard of Daniel Whitmore. Everyone in New York had. He was a real estate tycoon who owned half the Manhattan skyline. The billionaire whose face appeared on magazine covers with headlines like the Ice King of Commerce and the man who built an empire on cold calculation. At 35, he'd accumulated wealth most people couldn't imagine and a reputation for emotional detachment that was almost legendary. He was known for making ruthless business decisions without hesitation, for treating every interaction like a transaction, for never letting sentiment interfere with strategy. What Elena didn't know, what nobody knew except the very few people Daniel trusted, was that he hadn't always been this way. Years ago, Daniel Whitmore had been engaged to a woman named Catherine, an artist who made him laugh and made him feel like the wealth and power didn't matter as much as simply being present with someone you loved. They were planning a small wedding, talking about starting a family, building a life that balances ambition with her creativity. Then Catherine died in a car accident 3 weeks before their wedding. Sudden, senseless, a drunk driver running a red light and destroying Daniel's entire future in the space of seconds. Since that night, Daniel had systematically shut down every part of himself that could feel that kind of pain again. Emotions became liabilities he refused to carry. Love became a weakness he couldn't afford. He poured everything into building his empire, into creating something he could control, because controlling buildings and contracts and money was infinitely safer than risking his heart ever again. But none of this context was in Richard Chen's pitch to Elena. All she heard was the offer. Marriage to Daniel Whitmore in exchange for complete erasure of her mother's medical debt, full payment for all treatments, including experimental options, and a guaranteed income for Elena that would ensure she never had to work 3 jobs again. The terms were straightforward. 1 year minimum of marriage, maintaining the appearance of a legitimate relationship in public, separate living arrangements if she preferred, and absolutely no expectations of what she indelicately referred to as marital obligations. Mr. Whitmore is a very private man, Chen explained, his voice carefully neutral. He requires a wife for certain social and business appearances, but he has no interest in a traditional marriage. This would be, in essence, a business arrangement with substantial compensation for your participation. Elena stared at the stranger offering to solve every problem that was killing her, and she felt something break inside her chest. "Why me?" she managed to ask. Chen's answer was frustratingly vague. "Mr. Whitmore has done his research. He believes you would be suitable for his needs." What Chen didn't say, what Daniel had told him never to say, was that Daniel had been watching Elena for months, not in a creepy way, but in the way a man who'd given up on feeling anything suddenly found himself noticing someone who seemed to genuinely care about people. Daniel had seen Elena volunteering at a cancer support group his company sponsored, had watched her comfort other patients' family members with a kindness that seemed effortless and real, in a world where everyone wanted something from him, where every interaction was calculated for advantage. Elena's genuine compassion had caught his attention in a way he didn't fully understand and definitely didn't want to examine too closely. So he'd investigated, learned about her mother's diagnosis, learned about the crushing debt, learned about Elena's values, her character, her reputation for being kind but not naive, gentle but not weak. And he'd made a decision that was part strategy, part something he refused to name. He would offer her a solution, frame it as business, and ignore the small voice in his head that whispered this was about more than just needing a wife for appearances. Elena asked for time to think about it. Chen gave her 24 hours. She spent those hours sitting beside her mother's hospital bed, watching Margaret sleep fitfully between rounds of chemotherapy that were barely touching the cancer, listening to monitors beep and wondering what the hell she was supposed to do. When Margaret woke up, Elena tried to explain, without really explaining. "There's someone who wants to help with the medical bills," she said carefully, "but there would be conditions." Her mother, weak but still sharp, studied her daughter's face. What kind of conditions? Elena couldn't say it. Couldn't say she was considering selling herself into marriage to save her mother's life. But Margaret saw it anyway. Saw it in the way Elena couldn't meet her eyes, in the trembling of her hands. "Baby," Margaret whispered, reaching for Elena's hand. "You don't have to sacrifice yourself for me." "But I do," Elena said, tears finally falling. "Mom, I can't lose you. I can't. If there's a way to save you, even if it means..." "Even if it means what?" Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. "Marrying someone you don't love? Giving up your chance at real happiness." "I'll survive," Elena said, trying to sound stronger than she felt. "I'll find a way to make it work." Margaret was quiet for a long time, her hand still holding her daughter's. Finally, she whispered, "Then live, baby. Whatever you choose, make sure you really live." Elena signed the contract the next day. Her hand shook so badly she could barely hold the pen, but she signed every page, initialed every clause, and watched Richardson smile with professional satisfaction as he collected the documents that had just legally bound her to a man she didn't know. The first meeting with Daniel happened 3 days later, in his office on the 47th floor of a building that had his name carved in stone above the entrance. Elena wore her best professional outfit, a dress she bought on sale 2 years ago and had worn at every important meeting since, and tried not to feel completely out of place in a waiting room where the artwork probably cost more than her entire education. When she was finally shown into Daniel's office, she found him standing by floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over Manhattan like he owned it, which in many ways he did. He turned when she entered, and Elena got her first real look at the man she'd agreed to marry. Daniel Whitmore was tall, probably 6'2", with dark hair that was precisely cut and eyes that were an unsettling shade of gray-blue that seemed to look through her rather than at her. He wore a suit that was clearly custom-tailored, and he carried himself with the kind of confidence that comes from never having to wonder if you belong somewhere. He was handsome in that sharp, intimidating way that made Elena think of ice sculptures, beautiful but cold, impressive but untouchable. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice deep and controlled. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for..." Elena trailed off, unsure how to finish. "Thank you for buying me? Thank you for offering to save my mother in exchange for a year of my life?" There was no polite way to complete that sentence. Daniel seemed to understand. He gestured to a chair across from his desk and waited for her to sit before taking his own seat. The desk between them felt like a barrier, which Elena suspected was intentional. "I want to make sure we understand each other," Daniel said, his tone all business. "This arrangement is temporary and transactional. I need a wife for social and business purposes. You need financial security for your mother's care. We both get what we need without unnecessary complications." "Complications?" Elena repeated, trying to keep her voice steady. "Emotional entanglements," Daniel clarified, and something flickered in his eyes. "Pain, maybe, or memory. I'm not looking for love, Miss Carter. I'm not capable of it. This is a contract, nothing more." Elena should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt something closer to sadness of this man who spoke about incapacity for love like it was a feature instead of a tragedy. "And the living arrangements?" she asked, her cheeks flushing slightly. "You'll have your own bedroom," Daniel said immediately. "Your own space. I spend most of my time working anyway. You'll barely see me. And the public appearances? We'll attend necessary events together. Charity galas, business dinners, that sort of thing. We'll appear to be a normal married couple. In private, we maintain our own lives." And Elena couldn't say it. Couldn't ask a question that had been terrifying her since she signed the contract. Daniel's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "I won't touch you," he said quietly. "That's not what this is about." The relief was so intense Elena felt dizzy. But underneath the relief was something else. A strange, unexpected disappointment that she didn't want to examine. This man was offering her dignity, respect, freedom within their arrangement. So, why did it also feel like he was making it clear she wasn't someone he could ever actually want? They met twice more before the wedding, both meetings equally brief and formal. Daniel introduced her to his assistant who would help with wedding planning, his lawyer who explained additional legal protections she'd have, and his publicist who coached her on what to say if media asked questions. Everyone was professional, efficient, and careful not to ask Elena how she actually felt about any of this. The wedding was planned for 3 weeks later. Not enough time to think, which was probably Daniel's intention. Just enough time to get the marriage license, arrange the ceremony, and prepare Elena for the performance of her life. Her mother's treatment began immediately. The experimental drugs, the aggressive chemotherapy, the best oncologist money could buy. Margaret tried to talk to Elena about the wedding, tried to make sure her daughter was okay, but Elena deflected. She couldn't talk about it. Talking about it would make it too real, would force her to confront the fact that she was trading her body, or at least the legal rights to it, for her mother's survival. The night before the wedding, Elena stood in that Brooklyn apartment window, watching the city that had always represented possibility, and wondered what the hell she'd gotten herself into. Tomorrow she would put on a dress chosen by Daniel's stylist, walk down an aisle in a venue she'd seen exactly once, marry a man who made it clear he was incapable of love, and then, and this was the part that kept her awake, face a wedding night with a stranger who'd promised not to touch her, but legally had every right to change his mind. She was a virgin about to marry a billionaire who saw her as a business transaction. She was sacrificing everything her mother had taught her about intimacy and trust and connection being sacred. But her mother was alive, getting treatment, having a chance at survival because of this choice. So here's the question Elena couldn't answer, the one that haunted her as she watched those taxi lights blur into streaks of yellow in the darkness. When you sell yourself to save someone you love, when you sign away your autonomy in exchange for their survival, when you agree to become someone's wife without any promise of becoming someone they could actually care about, are you being brave or are you being broken? And more importantly, once you've made a deal like that, is there any way to take back the parts of yourself you've traded away? Or do they belong to him now, along with everything else the contract promised? Tomorrow, Elena Carter will become Elena Whitmore. But the real question wasn't about changing her name. It was about whether she still recognized herself when she looked in the mirror afterward. Elena stood in the penthouse bedroom, wearing a wedding dress that cost more than her mother's monthly treatment, waiting for her new husband to walk through the door and claim what the contract legally said belonged to him now. And the moment she heard his footsteps in the hallway, she realized that no amount of mental preparation could stop her hands from shaking. This is where everything changes. Because what happened on that wedding night, was it what Elena expected? Was it what you're probably expecting? And it set the stage for something far more complicated than a simple transaction between two people who were supposed to remain strangers. The wedding itself had been beautiful in that cold. Perfect way that money can buy but emotion can't fake. The venue overlooked the Hudson River from a private Manhattan space that normally required a year's notice and a donation that could feed a small country. Everything was elegant, expensive, and completely hollow. White roses that would die by Tuesday. Champagne that cost more per bottle than Elena used to make in a week. Guests who were all Daniel's business associates, investment partners, and society connections. Not a single person there who actually cared whether this marriage was real or just another strategic move in Daniel Whitmore's carefully calculated life. Elena had walked down that aisle alone. Her mother was too weak from chemotherapy to attend, still in the hospital recovering from the aggressive treatment that was finally, miraculously, starting to work. So Elena walked toward Daniel by herself, each step feeling less like approaching a future and more like walking toward a beautifully decorated cliff edge. Daniel stood at the altar in a tuxedo that probably cost more than the dress she was wearing, his expression neutral, his posture perfect, looking like a man attending a board meeting rather than his own wedding. When she reached him, when she stood close enough to see the tiny scar above his left eyebrow and smell the subtle cologne he wore, Elena searched his face for some hint of what he was feeling. Nervousness? Regret? Anticipation? But Daniel Whitmore had perfected the art of revealing nothing. His eyes were that same unsettling gray blue, looking at her, but somehow through her, like she was an attractive piece of furniture he'd acquired rather than a person he was binding his life to. The officiant went through traditional vows, and Daniel repeated them with perfect delivery and zero emotion. I, Daniel, take you, Elena, to be my lawfully wedded wife. His voice was steady, controlled, the voice of a man reading a contract aloud in a boardroom. When it was Elena's turn, her voice shook on almost every word, and she hated herself for the weakness, even as she understood it was the only honest thing about the entire ceremony. Then came the moment everyone was waiting for. You may kiss the bride. Daniel leaned in, his hand coming to rest lightly on her waist, and Elena's entire body tensed. This would be her first kiss. Not just her first kiss as a married woman, but her first real kiss ever. She'd saved this, protected this, believed it should mean something, and now it was happening in front of strangers as performance for a contract marriage. Daniel's lips touched hers, soft and brief, and it was over in seconds. A kiss that checked a box, fulfilled an obligation, meant absolutely nothing, except Elena felt it everywhere. And when Daniel pulled back for just a flash, maybe a second, maybe less, something crossed his face that looked almost like pain. The reception was more the same. Polite conversations with people who looked at Elena like they were trying to figure out her angle, like they couldn't quite believe Daniel Whitmore had chosen to marry someone so ordinary. Elena smiled through it all, played her part, let Daniel's hand rest on the small of her back during their first dance while a string quartet played, and everyone watched, and she felt like an actress in a play she'd never auditioned for. Daniel was attentive in public, the perfect new husband. He introduced her to business partners, included her in conversations, even laughed at something she said about architecture, though Elena suspected the laugh was as calculated as everything else. But she noticed something. Every time he touched her, guiding her through the crowd, pulling out her chair, dancing with his hand at her waist, his fingers trembled slightly. Not obviously, not enough for anyone else to notice. But Elena felt it, that tiny betrayal of control he worked so hard to maintain. By the time they left the reception, Elena's feet hurt from designer heels she wasn't used to wearing. Her face ached from smiling, and her heart was hammering so hard she thought everyone could hear it. Daniel's driver took them to the penthouse. Daniel's penthouse, though Elena supposed it was technically hers now too, at least for the next year. The building was one of those Manhattan towers where the doorman knew your name, and the elevator required a key just to access the top floor. Everything screamed wealth and exclusivity, and a world Elena still felt like she was trespassing in. They rode the elevator in silence. Daniel checked his phone, already mentally moving on to the next item on his agenda, while Elena tried to remember how to breathe normally. When the elevator opened directly into the penthouse, because of course it did, because normal doors were for normal people, Elena stepped into a space that looked like it belonged in an architecture magazine. Floor-to-ceiling windows with views of Manhattan that made the city look like a toy model. Furniture that was clearly designer, but somehow still managed to look cold and unused. Art on the walls that Elena recognized from her art history classes as the kind that appeared in museums, not homes. "Your bedroom is down the hall to the left," Daniel said, his voice carefully neutral. "Mine is on the opposite side. The kitchen is fully stocked if you need anything. Maria, the housekeeper, comes 3 times a week. If you need her more often, let me know." He was giving her a tour like she was a guest checking into a hotel, not his wife moving into their home. Elena nodded, tried to match his professional tone, even though everything inside her was screaming with confusion and fear and a strange, unexpected disappointment. "I have some work to finish," Daniel continued, already moving toward what Elena assumed was his office. "I'll be up late, so don't wait up." And just like that, he was gone, disappeared into another room and closed the door, leaving Elena standing alone in her wedding dress in a penthouse that felt more like a museum than a home. She should have been relieved. He was giving her space, keeping his distance, honoring the unspoken agreement that this was business, not intimacy. But instead, she felt abandoned, which was ridiculous, because you can't be abandoned by someone who was never really with you in the first place. Elena found her bedroom. Not just a bedroom, but a suite with a king-size bed, a sitting area, a bathroom that was bigger than her entire Brooklyn apartment, and a walk-in closet that had already been filled with clothes in her size. Designer clothes, beautiful clothes, clothes that Daniel or his assistant had selected without ever asking what Elena actually liked to wear. It should have felt like a gift. Instead, it felt like being dressed up as someone else's idea of who she should be. She stood in front of the mirror, looking at herself in this wedding dress that wasn't her style, in this life that wasn't her choice, and tried to figure out how she'd gotten here. The answer was simple: love for her mother, desperation, and the crushing weight of medical debt. But knowing why didn't make it feel any less surreal. Elena waited. She changed out of the wedding dress and into the silk nightgown that had been laid out on the bed. Another choice made for her, another piece of performance. She sat on the edge of the bed, then stood, then paced, then sat again. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. Daniel never appeared. At 2 a.m, Elena finally accepted that he wasn't coming. He'd meant what he said about separate bedrooms, about keeping distance, about this being purely transactional. She should have been grateful. Instead, she felt something that terrified her more than any wedding night obligation could have. She felt rejected, not wanted, chosen for a contract, but not chosen in any way that mattered. She was almost asleep when she heard the knock on her door. Soft, hesitant, completely unlike the confident Daniel she'd observed all day. Elena's heart jumped into her throat. She grabbed her robe, wrapped it around herself like armor, and opened the door to find her husband standing in the hallway, still wearing his tuxedo pants and shirt, but with the tie gone and the collar unbuttoned, looking more disheveled than she'd ever seen him. "I'm sorry," Daniel said quietly. "I should have checked that you had everything you needed." It was such a formal excuse for showing up at her door after 2 a.m. that Elena almost laughed. Almost. "I have everything," she managed to say. Daniel nodded but didn't leave. He stood there in the hallway, looking at her with an expression she couldn't read, and for a moment Elena thought he might actually come inside, might actually expect what she'd been terrified he would expect. Her hands gripped the robe tighter. But instead of moving toward her, Daniel moved away. Into the room, yes, but toward the windows, not the bed. He stood there looking out at Manhattan the way he had in his office, the way he seemed to whenever he needed distance between himself and whatever he was feeling. Minutes passed in silence. Elena stayed by the door, unsure whether to speak or wait or ask him to leave. Finally, he spoke, and his voice was different, rougher, more real, less controlled. "I won't touch you," he said to the window, to the city, maybe to himself. "You need to know that. This marriage, it's not about that." Elena's relief was so intense she felt dizzy. But underneath the relief was something else, something she didn't want to name. "Then what is it about?" she heard herself ask. Daniel finally turned to look at her, and in the dim light from the city outside, she saw something in his expression that she'd never seen before. Vulnerability. Pain. The carefully constructed walls cracking just enough to reveal that there was actually a human being behind them. "You didn't choose this," he said, and his voice was tight, strained, like every word cost him something. "You agreed because you had no choice. Because I gave you an offer you couldn't refuse when you were desperate. And I refuse," his hands clenched at his sides. "I refuse to be the kind of man who takes something from you that you're not ready to give." Elena felt tears burn her eyes, but she wouldn't let them fall. "Not yet. You paid for my mother's treatment. According to the contract, according to the law, you could." "I know what the contract says." Daniel cut her off sharply. "And I know what the law allows. But there are some things that shouldn't need contracts or laws to be wrong." He moved toward her slightly, then stopped himself. "You saved your virginity because it meant something to you, because you wanted it to be about connection, trust, something real. I won't be the man who turns that into just another transaction." The tears fell now, and Elena couldn't stop them. Not tears of fear or sadness, but tears of unexpected kindness from a man she'd been convinced was incapable of it. "Everyone said you were cold," she whispered. "They called you the Ice King." "I am cold," Daniel said, but his voice cracked on the words. "I've made myself cold because feeling anything else." He stopped, struggled, then continued. "I lost someone years ago. My fiancée, Catherine, 3 weeks before our wedding. She died in a car accident. Sudden, meaningless. One moment planning a future, the next moment that future just gone." Elena pressed her hand to her mouth, understanding flooding through her. This was why he'd shut down, why he treated marriage like a business transaction, why he'd carefully constructed a life where nothing could hurt him, because nothing really mattered. "Since then," Daniel continued, "I buried everything. Every feeling, every connection, every possibility of caring enough about someone that losing them could destroy me again. I built this empire, acquired all this wealth, surrounded myself with success because it's controllable. I can't control death, I can't control loss, but I can control my portfolio and my contracts and my distance from anything that might actually matter. So why get married at all?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why bring someone into your life if you spent years pushing everyone out?" Daniel laughed, but it was a hollow, bitter sound. Because the board of directors keeps pressuring me to settle down. Because business partners trust married men more than perpetual bachelors. Because my mother calls me every week asking when I'm going to give her grandchildren. Because he stopped, his jaw tightening. Because I'm 35 years old and I've been alone for so long I've almost convinced myself I prefer it this way. Almost. The vulnerability in that last word broke something in Elena. Here was this powerful man, this billionaire who seemed to have everything, admitting that his perfectly controlled life was actually a perfectly constructed prison. And she realized with sudden clarity that they weren't as different as she'd thought. She'd married him because she had no choice. He'd married her because he'd run out of ways to avoid choosing anything real. I don't know how to be close to people anymore, Daniel admitted, and the confession seemed to cost him everything. I don't know how to let someone matter. I've forgotten how to be anything other than controlled and distant and safe. So have I, Elena said, surprising herself at the honesty. Different reasons, but same result. I've spent my whole life waiting for something safe and real, protecting myself, making sure I never gave anything away unless it meant something. And now I'm married to you, and I don't know what I'm protecting anymore or if any of it even matters. They stood there in the expensive bedroom looking at each other. Two people who built walls for different reasons, but with the same result. Isolation that felt like safety, but was really just another kind of prison. The space between them felt charged with something Elena didn't have words for. Not attraction exactly. Though she couldn't deny Daniel was handsome even in his disheveled state. Something deeper, more dangerous. Recognition, maybe. The terrifying possibility that they might actually understand each other. I should let you sleep, Daniel said finally, but he didn't move. You could stay, Elena heard herself say, then immediately regretted it when she saw his expression shift. I don't mean, not like that. I mean, she struggled to find the words. I mean, maybe we could just talk, really talk, because I've been alone with my fear for months, and you've been alone with your grief for years, and maybe being alone isn't actually protecting either of us anymore. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, and Elena could see the internal battle playing out on his face. Safety versus risk. Control versus connection. Everything he'd built his life around versus something he'd sworn never to want again. Then, so slowly it was like watching ice begin to thaw. He nodded. They talked until the sun started rising over Manhattan, turning the sky from black to deep blue, to that particular shade of gold that only exists in cities at dawn. They sat on opposite ends of her bed, maintaining distance, keeping it safe, and they talked about everything the contract hadn't covered and the wedding hadn't addressed. Daniel told her about Catherine, really told her, about how they'd met at a gallery opening, about how she'd made him laugh by pointing out that he looked at art the same way he looked at quarterly reports, about how she'd slowly, patiently, taught him that not everything valuable could be quantified. Elena told him about her mother, about growing up with just enough but never extra, about learning that love sometimes meant sacrifice, but sacrifice didn't have to mean losing yourself. She told him about the night she signed his contract, about how her hands had shaken so badly she could barely hold the pen, about how her mother had whispered, "Live, baby," and Elena wasn't even sure what that meant anymore. And somewhere in those hours of talking, something shifted. The stranger she'd married started becoming a person. The Ice King started showing cracks that revealed someone who wasn't cold at all, but burning himself out from the inside, trying to keep everything frozen. And Elena started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, this impossible situation might become something neither of them had expected. As dawn light filled the room, Daniel stood to leave. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for listening, for..." He paused, searching for words. "For not being afraid of me." "I am afraid of you," Elena admitted, "just not in the way you think." Daniel's expression was questioning, but Elena didn't elaborate. How could she explain that her fear wasn't about what he might do to her, but about what she might start to feel for him? That the real danger wasn't the contract, but the possibility that she might actually start caring about a man who'd explicitly said he was incapable of caring back? He left. She lay down on sheets that still smelled new and expensive and tried to process what had just happened. Her wedding night had been nothing like she'd feared. No demands, no expectations, no obligation fulfilled. Instead, it had been something infinitely more dangerous. Two broken people recognizing each other's damage and not running away. But here's the question that kept Elena awake even as exhaustion pulled at her. When you marry someone to save another person's life, when you build a relationship on contracts and desperation, when two people who've sworn to never let anyone close start talking until dawn, can something real grow and soil that poison? Can you build genuine connection on a foundation of transaction? And more importantly, when one person starts hoping for something more, and the other person has explicitly said they're incapable of giving it, who ends up getting hurt worse? The one who dares to feel, or the one who refuses to? Elena fell asleep with those questions unanswered. But when she woke up 6 hours later, there was a note on her nightstand in handwriting she didn't recognize yet. Your mother's treatment is going well. The doctors say she can have visitors this afternoon. I've arranged a car for you at 2. D. And Elena realized something that both comforted and terrified her. Daniel Whitmore might claim to be incapable of caring, might have built walls so high she couldn't see over them, might have turned his heart into something cold and controlled. But a man who truly didn't care wouldn't have noticed she'd want to see her mother, wouldn't have called the hospital, wouldn't have arranged a car, wouldn't have left a note because he knew she'd be anxious when she woke up alone. The Ice King was melting. The question was whether Elena would survive the flood when all that frozen emotion finally thawed. 6 months into a marriage that was supposed to mean nothing. Elena woke up one morning and realized the most dangerous thing that could happen had already happened. She started falling in love with a man who'd explicitly told her he was incapable of loving her back, and the question that terrified her wasn't whether she should protect her heart, but whether it was already too late. This is where impossible situations become real relationships, where contracts give way to genuine connection, and where two people who marry for all the wrong reasons have to decide if they're brave enough to stay together for the right ones. The months after that wedding night had unfolded in ways Elena never anticipated. The distance Daniel promised gradually dissolved into something that felt dangerously close to actual companionship. It started small, shared breakfasts that turned into real conversations instead of polite silence. Daniel asking about Elena's mother, genuinely listening when she talked about Margaret's recovery, even visiting the hospital with her once, and sitting quietly while Elena held her mother's hand. Margaret had looked at Daniel with those sharp eyes that saw through everything and whispered to Elena later, "That man cares about you more than he wants to admit." Elena had dismissed it then. Her mother was on heavy pain medication, reading too much into basic human decency. But as weeks turned into months, she started noticing things that made her wonder if Margaret had seen something Elena was too afraid to acknowledge. The way Daniel's whole body seemed to relax when she walked into a room. How he'd started leaving little notes around the penthouse. Not romantic declarations. Just small observations. Your favorite tea was running low. I order more. There's a gallery opening on Friday, if you're interested. No pressure. You were right about that architecture book. It's actually fascinating. Small things. Thoughtful things. The kind of things someone does when they're paying attention not because they have to, but because they want. The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was gradual, almost imperceptible, like watching ice melt so slowly you don't notice it happening until suddenly there's water where there used to be frost. Daniel started coming home earlier, trading 12-hour workdays for dinners with Elena, where they'd talk about everything from city development projects to childhood memories to books they both read. He smiled more, not the polished professional smile he used for business associates, but genuine expressions that reached his eyes and made him look younger, less burdened, almost like the man he might have been before grief taught him that caring was dangerous. Elena, for her part, found herself transforming in ways she hadn't expected. The scared girl who'd signed that contract was gone, replaced by someone stronger, more confident. She started taking business courses at Daniel's gentle suggestion, discovering she had a natural talent for strategy and analysis. She'd begun volunteering at the cancer support group, where Daniel's company had first noticed her, using her position as Mrs. Whitmore to raise funds and awareness. She'd found purpose beyond just survival, and having Daniel support her efforts, attending fundraisers, making substantial donations, even helping her develop proposals for new programs, made her feel seen in a way she'd never experienced. But the more comfortable they became with each other, the more complicated everything felt. Because comfort breeds familiarity, and familiarity breeds something more dangerous. Elena started noticing things she shouldn't notice. The way Daniel's hair looked in the morning when he hadn't styled it yet. The sound of his laugh when something genuinely amused him instead of when he was just being polite. The particular shade of blue his eyes turned when he looked at her across the breakfast table. The way her heart would speed up when she heard his key in the door, knowing he was home. She was falling for him. And the realization terrified her because Daniel had been explicitly clear about what this marriage was. Temporary, transactional, emotionally safe. He'd opened up that first night about his past, about Catherine, about his inability to risk his heart again. Elena had understood then. She'd accepted it. She'd agreed to those terms. But hearts don't care about contracts. And 6 months of living with someone, of sharing space and meals and conversations, and slowly dissolving walls. 6 months was long enough for Elena to forget that this was supposed to end. Long enough to start imagining a future that the contract didn't promise. Long enough to wonder what it would feel like if Daniel kissed her again. Really kissed her, not as performance, but as something real. The moment everything changed happened on a rainy Thursday evening in November. Elena had spent the day at the hospital with her mother, celebrating Margaret's official remission, 5 months cancer-free. The experimental treatment had worked. Her mother was going to live. Elena should have felt nothing but joy, and she did feel joy, but underneath it was something more complicated. The realization that the crisis that had forced this marriage no longer existed. The debt was paid. Her mother was saved. According to the contract, Elena could leave after 1 year. 6 months had passed. 6 more months, and she'd be free to walk away from this arrangement with financial security and no obligations. 6 months until she'd have to say goodbye to the man she'd accidentally fallen in love with. She came home that evening to find Daniel in the kitchen, which was unusual enough to make her pause. He didn't cook. They had a private chef who prepared meals. But there he was, attempting to make pasta, flowers somehow on his expensive shirt, looking adorably frustrated in a way she'd never seen before. "What are you doing?" Elena asked, unable to hide her smile. Daniel looked up, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "Your mother got her 5-month remission confirmation today," he said. "I thought we should celebrate. I tried to make your favorite dish." He gestured at the kitchen, which looked like a flower bomb had exploded. "Not very good at this." Elena felt tears burn her eyes. He'd remembered her favorite food from a conversation they'd had weeks ago. He'd tried to cook it himself instead of having it professionally prepared. He'd made a mess of his pristine kitchen because he wanted to do something personal for her. "Daniel," she whispered, not trusting her voice for anything louder. He stepped toward her, and Elena saw something in his eyes that she'd never seen before, or maybe had seen but hadn't let herself recognize. Want, need, fear, all the things he'd been hiding behind walls that were suddenly, visibly crumbling. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice rough. "And I don't know how to say it without—" He stopped, struggled, continued, "without breaking the rules we set." Elena's heart was hammering. What rules? The rules that say this is temporary. That say we're not supposed to feel anything. That say when the year is up, we walk away and go back to our separate lives like none of this mattered. He moved closer, close enough that Elena could see the pulse jumping in his throat. "I can't do that anymore." "Can't do what?" Elena needed him to say it. Needed to hear the words. Needed confirmation that she wasn't imagining the way he'd been looking at her for weeks. "Can't pretend this is just a contract," Daniel said. "Can't pretend I don't look forward to coming home because you're here. Can't pretend I don't think about you constantly when I'm supposed to be focused on work. Can't pretend that somewhere in the last 6 months, this stopped being an arrangement and started being," he stopped, his jaw tightening, "started being the most real thing in my life." Elena couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only stand there while her entire world rearranged itself around words she'd stopped hoping to hear. "I know I said I was incapable of this," Daniel continued, words tumbling out like he'd been holding them back for too long. "I know I told you I'd buried everything, that I couldn't risk caring again. I meant it when I said it. But you—" His hand reached out almost touching her face, then pulling back like he wasn't sure he had permission. "You made me forget why I was protecting myself. You made me want to try." "Daniel," Elena said, and her own voice shook. "The contract says 6 more months, and then I'm free to leave." "I know." His expression was devastated. "And I know I have no right to ask you to stay. You married me because you were desperate, because I gave you no choice. Every day you're here is because of that contract, not because you chose me. And when it ends, you'll have every reason to walk away and build a life that's actually yours." "What if I don't want to walk away?" The words came out before Elena could stop them, before she could think about self-protection or pride, or any of the reasons she should keep her feelings hidden. Daniel went completely still. "What? What if somewhere in the last 6 months, I stopped thinking about this as obligation and started thinking about it as..." Elena struggled with the word, with a terrifying vulnerability to say it out loud, as home. The kiss happened so fast Elena didn't have time to prepare. One moment they were standing apart. The next Daniel's hands were in her hair and his mouth was on hers. And this was nothing like that brief, performative kiss at their wedding. This was desperate and real and full of 6 months of wanting and denying and finally giving in. Elena kissed him back with everything she'd been hiding, every feeling she'd tried to suppress, every moment she'd watched him and wondered what this would be like. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. "I'm terrified," he admitted, "of feeling this much, of needing someone again, of losing them." Elena finished quietly. "I know, but Daniel, you've already lost one person you loved. You know how much it hurts. Are you really going to lose another one by being too afraid to hold on?" His hands were shaking where they held her face. "What if I'm not good at this? What if I've been closed off for so long that I don't remember how to?" "Then we'll figure out together," Elena said. "You said it yourself. This is the most real thing in your life. It's the most real thing in mine, too. We started this marriage all wrong, but maybe we can build something right from all those wrong pieces." The next few weeks were like watching a different person emerge from Daniel's carefully constructed shell. He wasn't suddenly transformed into some romantic ideal. He still worked too much, still struggled with expressing emotion, still had moments where Elena could see him wanting to retreat behind his walls. But he was trying. He'd come home with flowers he'd picked out himself, looking embarrassed and uncertain. He'd hold her hand while they walked through Central Park. He'd tell her about his day, about his frustrations and fears, about the things he used to keep locked away. And slowly, Elena started sharing her own vulnerabilities, her fear that she wasn't sophisticated enough for his world, her worry that she'd always be known as the wife he bought, her uncertainty about what she actually wanted to do with her life beyond just surviving. Daniel listened, really listened, and instead of dismissing her concerns or trying to fix everything, he just validated them, made her feel heard, made her feel like her feelings mattered to him in ways that went far beyond any contract. But the contract still existed. The end date was still approaching. And despite everything that had changed between them, neither of them had actually addressed what would happen when they reached that 1-year mark. Would they renew, renegotiate, simply continue without any legal framework? Or would they finally make this marriage real in every sense of the word? The confrontation came on a cold December evening, 3 weeks before their 1-year anniversary. Daniel's lawyer arrived at the penthouse with dissolution papers, as contractually required. Elena watched Daniel's face go pale when Richardson spread the documents across the dining table. "These are your options," Chin explained professionally. "Sign here to dissolve the marriage. Sign here to extend for another year under the same terms. Or," he paused, glancing between them, "there's a third option. Nullify the original contract and file for a standard marriage certificate. Start over, legally speaking, as a couple who chose each other." Elena couldn't read Daniel's expression. After weeks of him opening up, suddenly the walls were back, the Ice King facade firmly in place. Her heart sank. This was it, the moment she'd been dreading. He was going to choose distance again, going to retreat behind his protection, going to prove that 6 months of connection couldn't overcome years of self-preservation. "Could you give us a moment?" Daniel asked Chun, his voice carefully controlled. When they were alone, Daniel picked up the dissolution papers, staring at them like they were written in a language he didn't understand. Elena waited, her heart breaking with every second of silence. Finally, he looked up at her. "I need to know something," he said, "and I need you to be completely honest. If money wasn't a factor, if your mother's health wasn't a concern, if there was no contract and no obligation, would you want to be married to me?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, like a plea, like everything they'd been building toward for 6 months. Elena could lie, could protect herself, could keep something held back just in case he broke her heart. Or she could do what Daniel had been brave enough to do weeks ago. She could risk everything by being honest. "Yes," she said simply, "I would choose you, every day, not because of what you can give me or what you've done for my mother. I'd choose you because you're kind even when you're trying to pretend you're not, because you make terrible pasta but try it anyway, because you leave notes that make me smile, because you spent 6 months showing me what it looks like when someone who's forgotten how to care learns to care again. Because I love you, Daniel. Not the contract, not the lifestyle, not the security. You." Daniel set down the papers with shaking hands. "I don't deserve you," he said, and his voice cracked. "I bought you like you were property. I took advantage of your desperation. I should let you go, should give you freedom to find someone who didn't start by trapping you. You gave me the choice that first night," Elena reminded him. "You could have demanded everything the contract allowed, but instead you gave me dignity. You've given me choices every day since then. Daniel, you didn't trap me. You freed me. You saved my mother, yes, but you also showed me I was capable of more than I believed. You supported my education, my volunteer work, my dreams. A man who treats someone like property doesn't do those things. But what if I fail you?" Daniel's question was desperate, raw. What if I retreat again? What if I have a bad day and shut down and hurt you because I'm still learning how to be open? Then we'll work through it. Elena said, "That's what real marriage is, isn't it? Not the perfect version from contracts and vows, but the messy, complicated, choose each other every day version. I'm not asking you to be perfect, Daniel. I'm just asking you to keep trying." Daniel crossed the space between them and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight Elena could feel his heart racing against her chest. "I love you," he whispered into her hair. "I didn't think I'd ever say those words again. Didn't think I was capable of feeling them. But Elena, I love you so much it terrifies me." They stood there holding each other while Manhattan glittered outside the windows. Two people who'd started as strangers in a transaction and somehow found their way to something real. When they finally pulled apart, Daniel walked to the table and picked up the third option, the one that nullified the contract and started over. He signed it without hesitation, then handed the pen to Elena. She looked at the document, at Daniel's signature, at the man who'd been so afraid to feel anything that he'd built walls around his entire life. The man who'd torn those walls down because of her. For her. With her. Elena signed her name beside his. 3 months later, they had a second wedding. Not the cold, performative ceremony in a Manhattan venue with strangers watching, but a small, intimate gathering with people who actually mattered. Margaret was there, healthy and crying happy tears. A few of Daniel's actual friends, not business associates, but real friends he'd been slowly reconnecting with. Elena's college roommate who'd watched her struggle through those dark months. Dr. Chun, smiling as he witnessed what his legal documents had helped create. And this time, when Daniel said his vows, there was emotion in every word. "I, Daniel, take you, Elena, not because of obligation or contracts or anything except the fact that you taught me I was still capable of loving someone. You took my frozen heart and patiently, gently, showed me it could still beat. I choose you, today, tomorrow, and every day after." When it was Elena's turn, she looked at this man who'd saved her mother's life, and somehow save her own in the process. "I, Elena, take you, Daniel, because somewhere between desperation and destination, I found home. You weren't what I expected. You were what I needed. And I choose you, not because I have to, but because I genuinely want to, because love that grows from the most broken places is sometimes the strongest kind." The kiss after those vows was nothing like their first wedding kiss. This one was witnessed by people who loved them, blessed by a journey that had transformed them both, and full of the promise that they were done with contracts and obligations and starting over with nothing but choice. That night, when they returned to the penthouse, their home now, not his with her as temporary guest, Daniel took Elena's hand and led her to the bedroom. And this time there was no fear, no obligation, no contract dictating terms. Just two people who'd learned that sometimes the most unexpected beginnings lead to the most beautiful endings. The intimacy that followed wasn't perfect or without nervousness or exactly like the romantic movies. But it was real. It was chosen. It was sacred in exactly the way Elena had always believed intimacy should be, born from trust and connection, and genuine love rather than obligation. And for Daniel, it was healing in ways he hadn't known he needed. Proof that his heart wasn't dead, but had just been waiting for someone patient enough to resurrect it. 6 months later, they were sitting on their terrace overlooking the city that had witnessed their journey, Elena's hand resting on her barely visible baby bump, when she asked, "Do you ever think about how we started?" "About the contract." Daniel pulled her closer. "Every day. And every day I'm grateful you were desperate enough to say yes to a stranger's proposal. And every day I'm grateful that stranger turned out to be you," Elena added. "You know what the crazy thing is?" Daniel said thoughtfully, "I told you I needed a wife for business appearances, for board approval, for social expectations. But the truth is, I'd been watching you for months before your mother got sick. I'd seen you volunteer, seen your kindness, and I was drawn to something in you that I didn't even understand. When I heard about the medical debt, I told myself I was just being practical, solving two problems at once. But I think," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "I think part of me was looking for an excuse to bring you into my life. I just didn't know how to admit I wanted connection." Elena turned to look at him. "You're saying the contract was an excuse?" "I'm saying my heart knew what my head refused to acknowledge. I needed you, Elena, not a wife for appearances. You specifically. I just didn't have the courage to pursue you honestly. So I built a business framework around what was really just a desperate man's attempt to not be alone anymore. It was the most vulnerable admission Daniel had ever made, and Elena loved him more for it. Then I'm glad we were both desperate enough to find each other," she said. They sat there as the sun set over Manhattan, the city that never slept but had somehow given two insomniacs a place to finally find rest. A contract marriage that became a love story. A transaction that transformed into a partnership. A desperate bargain that evolved into a chosen commitment. So here's what I want you to understand. Sometimes the worst circumstances create the best outcomes. Sometimes being forced into something impossible is exactly what you need to discover what's actually possible. Elena married Daniel to save her mother's life, and in the process, she saved his life too, not in the medical sense, but in the way that matters most. She reminded him he was still alive, still capable of feeling, still deserving of love despite his past losses. And Daniel gave Elena something she'd been searching for her whole life. A relationship built on respect, patience, and genuine care rather than pressure or obligation. He proved that intimacy could be exactly what she'd always believed it should be. Sacred, safe, and earned through connection rather than demanded through contracts. Their story isn't perfect. They still have hard days, still struggle with communication sometimes, still have to actively choose each other when things get difficult. But that's what makes it real. That's what makes it matter. Now I want to hear from you. If you've been in Elena's position, facing impossible debt and an offer that could save someone you love but cost you your autonomy, what would you have done? Would you have signed that contract? And more importantly, do you believe that love can genuinely grow from situations that start with desperation and obligation, or is that just a beautiful fantasy? Drop your honest answer in the comments. Tell me about a time when something that started terribly ended up being exactly what you needed. And if this story reminded you that sometimes the best things come from the most unexpected places, hit that subscribe button, because we got more stories about people who found love in impossible circumstances, who turned contract into connections, and who prove that the heart knows things ahead takes forever to understand. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that frozen hearts can thaw, that desperate beginnings don't determine destinations, and that choosing to stay can be just as powerful as choosing to leave. I'll see you in the next story, where we'll explore what happens when the person you married to escape from becomes the person you can't imagine living without.